Hello and welcome to India News TV. I'm Karthik Singh. Lately, we have seen a series of religiously motivated attacks in various parts of France, which led various French leaders to issue strong statements on the need to enlighten Islam and the so-called radical Muslims. What are some of the factors which have been leading to such a tragic situation when it comes to religious harmony in France? And what are some of the impacts which such a tough stance of French politicians will bring with it? These are some of the key issues we are exploring today with Ms. Audrey Courty, who is a PhD researcher at Griffith University on media and political movements. Audrey, what do you think are some of the factors which have been leading to such gruesome and fatal attacks in France and in Europe? And also the shift in stance by the French government, which is from being a centrist to a far right.
There's a multitude of social, cultural, economic, political factors and psychological factors that can lead someone to react violently, in Western societies. And some of the key factors we find are, especially amongst Muslim youths that have grown up in a European country, we find that the socioeconomic factors, so economic disadvantage, so high levels of unemployment, feeling alienated, like you're not connecting with the society, like you're finding it hard to figure out your identity, your place in that society. All that contributes to this feeling of disenfranchisement that can make you very vulnerable to jihadist groups who, it's not just about, oh, they hate our freedoms and our lifestyles. The way these jihadist groups lure Muslim youths and radicalize them is by drawing them in with these promises of a community, an identity, a brotherhood, or even a sisterhood in the cases of women. And this is kind of how they appeal to them. It's very similar in a way to youths that join gangs or sects. There's this, it's the same kind of pull factors that can draw them in. So these are all factors that contribute to it, but in terms of international terrorism, we find that a lot of times geopolitics comes into play as well. So when you look at a country's foreign policies, that can influence and increase the radicalization of jihadists who frequently use the things that Western governments do in the Middle East as proof that the West is waging a war on Islam or on all Muslims, which is not true, but this is how they represent it. It's this, they push this clash of civilizations narrative. And now to answer the other part of your question, in terms of what's going on in France right now and Macron's response to the recent spate of attacks in France, I've noticed over the last 6 months that I was in France, and there's been a noticeable shift in the language of what is supposedly a centrist government when it comes to discussions about Islam, Islamism, radicalization, and in terms of responses of attacks. I think up until now, Macron and his administration have been quite sensible in the way they talk about this. So they've been careful in distinguishing between Islam and Islamism, terrorism and Muslims. They've been quite careful about that. But I think recently they've lost that nuance. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Obviously, after an attack, emotions run high. It's more difficult to be sensible in those moments. But in particular, what disappoints me about the current administration in France is I think they're pandering to the far right or to far right voters by conflating now Islam and terrorism, by taking this this less ambiguous stance. It's very clear now that they're scapegoating Muslims. It's quite alarming actually to see a centrist government now adopt the language of the far right, and then to see Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far right party in France, congratulate Macron for supposedly coming to his senses on Islam. So that is quite concerning to me. It's really alarming when you see such a general shift and when you see the media and public discourse just parroting these sorts of extremist narratives in response to extremism. It's only, I think, feeding the problem even more.
So what are some of the factors you think have been leading to a religious disharmony in France and Europe in particular?
I think we have to be very careful when we say religiously motivated attacks. We need to be careful in distinguishing between Islam on the one hand, which is the religion, and Islamism on the other hand, which is political Islam, or the politicization of religion. And when we're talking about radicalization in France, we're specifically talking about problems related to Islamism, this political ideology. And some of the factors that have led to this are, you have to look at the international geopolitical context. Particularly when we're talking about international terrorism, they have this political project against the West. But there's also, we have to think about homegrown terrorism as well. And there's other factors that lead to radicalization on homegrown soil. Some of these it's quite complex. I disagree, for example, with Macron when he oversimplifies the problem and says, well, these people hate our freedoms and our way of life. That might be true maybe for international jihadists, but when it comes to a young Muslim man in France committing an act of terror, a lot of them are born in France, have grown up in France. We're talking about second or third generation immigrants, but they are French citizens. We're talking about different set of motivating factors. Some of these are often socioeconomic, so a lot of these youths are economically disadvantaged. There are high levels of employment amongst Muslim youths in France. We also see in terms of housing, there is a lot of, they're quite isolated, but also in general, you have these youths that feel quite alienated and are struggling to identify with their country of birth and reconcile maybe their religious values or their religious identity with a country that, to be honest, has been quite hostile recently to Muslims. So there are a number of factors, and this is what makes young Muslim men or Muslim youth in France vulnerable to some of these Islamist narratives, because it's about more than just hating freedom. It's also about an Islamist group gives you an identity. It gives you a brotherhood or a sisterhood. And these are some of these things that these youths are lacking as well. So it's much more complex than what we're making it out to be. And it's important to consider this when we're implementing counterterrorism measures.
In that case, how do you see the French president's statement when he says that there are a lot of external factors which have been sort of influencing how Islam is taught in France, in mosques and religious organizations?
Well, you have an issue with, so you've got your Muslim populations, but you also have certain pockets of Islamist groups. They might not be violent, and that's also the reason why it's hard to stem the influence of these groups, because they're not doing anything illegal, but they're pushing some of these separatist narratives or these divisive narratives. And there is certainly a problem with that we need to address. But it's also important not to feed those divisive narratives by non-Muslims or the government itself pushing divisive rhetoric. So we're really kind of feeding that propaganda. We need to be united, both Muslims and non-Muslims, in countering these sorts of narratives.
My next question, Audrey, is in general, do you see any fundamental difference between the principles of liberal democracies and the kind of fundamental Islamic ideas which are sort of spread across these sort of groups which are now being cracked down upon? So how do you see that? Is there a fundamental difference?
There is definitely a fundamental difference between Western liberal values and Islamist or Islamic fundamentalism or political Islam. So one of the key differences would be secularism in France, for example, and this Islamist notion of creating a society that reflects religious values. Really, those two are integrated when it comes to Islamist ideology. But again, it's important to remember that Islamism and Islam are not the same things. And I actually think there is a lot in common between Islamic values and Western liberal values. There's been studies, for example, of European Muslims and what some of their thoughts are about society, their values, whether it's on democracy, their views of women. And it's actually not that different to non-Muslim French people's views. The key issue here is these Islamist groups who, once again, it's, the minority is always the noisiest. They make a lot of noise. We're giving them a lot more airtime than we give non-Islamists. And we tend to conflate the two. We conflate Muslims and Islamists. So that has a key part in terms of we're portraying this religion in exactly the way that Islamists and jihadists want to portray it. And that's very problematic because they are not a reflection of the values and attitudes of wider Muslim populations.
Audrey, do you think that the series of attacks which we have seen in France and, for that matter, in Vienna, Austria, will undermine the liberal values of France and of Europe in general?
What kinds of liberal values? Do you mean freedom of expression?
Freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and...
I don't think freedom of expression is under threat in France. I think anyone that knows French people, I think they're very outspoken people. And of course, I mean, no one's changing the laws. So I don't think freedom of expression is under threat in France. And I think it would be very alarmist to say all of a sudden, because you have Muslims in countries that have an issue with portrayals of the Prophet and have been vocal about it. I don't think that threatens freedom of expression. Again, the laws haven't changed. I do, even in a country like Australia, in lots of liberal societies, freedom of expression is deeply embedded in our institutions, but there's always been, clauses where not all types of speech are permitted. For example, libel, defamation. Yeah, it's reasonable restrictions. I think I'm a strong proponent of freedom of expression, but freedom of expression doesn't mean freedom from consequence of what you say. I think we need to be more sensible in, especially when it comes to Islam and Muslims. What we say is not, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There is a context. We need to be more sensitive. It doesn't mean changing our laws, but we shouldn't have to be provocative or scandalize on purpose at a time where relations are very frail and tensions are high. We shouldn't really kind of keep adding fuel to the fire, basically.
So on that note, I've got another question, which is like, you're a French yourself, and we have got a clear division of people when it comes to freedom of expression and speech and how they take it. So in that case, 2050, Charlie Hebdo's magazine, which was very controversial, and there was a whole lot of divide amongst a section of population as to whether it sort of, it is within the limits and boundaries of freedom and speech, or whether it goes beyond that. How do you see that, and what kind of take on that? What
is my take on the response?
On the response of that, and how do you see? Is that within the boundary of freedom of speech, or does that go beyond the boundary of freedom of expression?
I mean, you are free to publish. I mean, I don't think any laws were overstepped in the portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad in Charlie Hebdo, but I do think it was very provocative, and it was meant to get a reaction. And so I don't think I don't think it overstepped any kind of legal boundaries, but it certainly overstepped we have different definitions of what's sacred in the public space, right? For example, in France, we have laws against portrayals of things that go against, icons of the Republic. We have things like that embedded already, and just because portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad is not something that's sacred to a non-Muslim in France, it doesn't mean that we can't negotiate that. I'm always a bit concerned about implementing laws that start setting boundaries and limits, especially when it comes to freedom of speech. But I just think we should we should just be more sensible in how we talk about these issues, and just be aware of context and not try and be provocative just for the sake of being provocative, which I feel is what a lot of these cartoons were about. I don't really think they were trying to make a point. I think they were trying to be provocative for the sake of being provocative. And we just have to be aware of that. Just be more sensitive and sensible. Be more sensitive to other people's sensibilities as well.
Now, Audrey, my last question is, as a French youth yourself, how do you think that the youth in France are taking all these events?
I think it's very saddening. I'm very saddened by what's happening. Compared to other countries like Australia and America, at the moment, since 2012, France really has had a far greater problem with Islamist extremism and radicalization and attacks than other countries. They generally have a problem right now. And it's really saddening when you especially in the last few weeks, for example, it's just one attack after another. So I think they're saddened, and I think everyone is trying to make sense of what's happening. As societies right now, we're facing more and more complicated issues, and I think it's hard sometimes to really kind of parse through what really the causes are. And I think as they're trying to make sense of things, I can't speak on behalf of them, but I think we have the right intentions. I think no one wants to see more of this happen, but I don't think we always know how to pinpoint the true cause of it. Personally, I'm deeply saddened by the government's response. So unfortunately, terrorism is very good at doing what it's intended to do, which is sow panic and division. It's very good at doing that. And when we react in the way jihadists want us to react, we're just feeding this extremism even more. So, there's countless jihadist manuals that say the purpose of terrorist attacks is to create a wedge between Muslims and non-Muslims. And this is precisely why we have to, show a united front. Muslims and non-Muslims are united in this, in countering Islamist narratives. And I think that's the main message I would like French youth, but also the French government to keep in mind. We keep saying it, but I think Macron has been good up until now in being nuanced about talking about these issues. But I think recently he's been trying to score political points, and he's been scapegoating Muslims. And it's so saddening to see a supposedly centrist government co-opt and adopt the language of the far right. Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far right party in France, actually congratulated Macron recently for finally coming to his senses about Islam and Islamism. That's really concerning. And now you've even got the education minister calling out academics involved in research like I am, in multicultural research, in radicalization research, and condemning them as Islamo-leftists. So it's very oppressive. You're not allowing other narratives to join this debate. And as a result, we're not really having any constructive discussions about how to tackle these issues.
Audrey, do you see a clear divide in the kind of stance and positions which political parties and leaders across Europe in general are taking when it comes to incidents such as these?
Yes, I think there is a range of different ways that different governments or different political parties frame the issue of radicalization, and in turn, because of the different causes they've identified, people also identify different solutions to the problem. I think, for example, a clear example of this would be over time, we've noticed in Europe a shift in policies, even just a general shift. In the past, there were these assimilationist policies. So it's important to distinguish between assimilation and integration. Assimilation is very much a one-way process where immigrants that were coming into a country there was a bit of an erasure of the identity of their culture. They just had to completely adapt to the values and culture of the country they were migrating to. And then when we talk about integrationist or multicultural policies, that's more of a two-way process. There's more of a negotiation and an exchange of cultures happening there. And I think, in more recent history, we've pushed towards more multicultural policies, but it doesn't seem to be working quite right. So when you look at France or Germany, it's a tricky process. And I think it's because we often forget integration, yes, is a two-way process. For me to feel well adjusted to a community, I have to feel right economically, socially, culturally. I have to feel welcome as well. It's not just about me learning the language, me, adapting to the laws or norms of that society, but there has to be a return on that as well. And I think in some of these societies, like France, we still find that Muslims, and a lot of them are citizens. They're second and third generation immigrants, but they're born and raised in France. They're more French in some cases than I am. So it's interesting to see how they're still quite segregated in the society. And you see this happen, in terms of housing. You see this happen in terms of employment. And this is very problematic. I think in order for integration and multiculturalism to be successful, there has to be much more of an exchange and a two-way process. But that's really hard to do when you then throw the problem of radicalization, extremism, which is coming from Islamist groups who keep trying to create a wedge. It's becoming harder and harder. And now you're seeing a return because the problem's not going away. You now see, for example, the Macron government kind of returning to this idea of repression and pushing it down, but that's actually what's making the problem worse. You're playing into the hands of radicals by continuing to separate Muslims and non-Muslims. And then, for example, you see Merkel, who recently spoke about the fact that we're all in this together, who is trying to push a counter-narrative that's much more, that unites everyone, Muslims and non-Muslims, against this common enemy of Islamism. But it's not always 100%, you know, there's a lot of nuance, it's quite a complex issue, and sometimes we lose that. Even someone like Angela Merkel sometimes might not always get it right. So I think, yeah, it's a tricky issue, and governments are reacting, you know, responding differently. We've tried a lot of different things, but it's not really working because I don't think the effort is quite concerted enough. And I think you have a lot of different political players that are exploiting the division and trying to make it worse for their own political gains, which is really not helping us kind of counter this problem.
On that note, Audrey, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for giving an interview to India News. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the video. If you like it, please press the like button, share your views in the comment section, and please subscribe to India News TV for more such updates.